Hey guys, Justin from Extreme Transmission. Today we have a 1997 Ford F350. Needs an upper ball joint. Let me run you guys through a few things. I know we're about mid-stroke here, but I wanted to make sure that you guys could see this, so we made the decision to film it. All right, so we want to take off this upper nut. And that lower nut. And we're going to leave that upper on just ever so slightly so that the entire knuckle doesn't fall down to the ground. All right, let's heat it up, see if we can get somewhere. And now for the lower. Once again, putting a little heat to it. All right, guys, bunch of heat and some penetrating oil, and we finally got this thing loose. So let's go ahead and pull it out of here, get it over to the bench, get some joints put in it. All right, guys, we got it off, got the knuckle off, got it on the bench. I want to show you a handful of things that I did just make my life a little bit easier. First and foremost, I cut the top ball joint off just simply so I didn't have 20 adapters in the way. It makes shooting this a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and press these ball joints out, and we'll get on with life. Just pulling off grease zerks, keep things a little easier out of the way, not smashing a bunch of junk. We'll go ahead and do the lower ball joint first. If you look here at the bottom, there's a snap ring. We need to remove that snap ring. Pull that snap ring off, and then we can start pressing it out. There you go, lowers out. Upper, here we go. Upper's out. Alright, so now what we'll do is we'll take that over to the parts washer, get it cleaned up a little bit, make it respectable, and start pressing new joints in. Alright guys, so we got the knuckle all cleaned up. I did take a sanding disc, come in here and clean this stuff up a little bit so it'll press together a little nicer. I'll tell you about the joints after we get them pressed in, but let's go ahead and press these in. Alright, I'm using a bushing driver on the top here just to get us some room. So keep that in mind. All right, we have just a little bit of a gap. Let's try to close that up. All good to go. All right, now for the bottom. Okay, let's put the snap ring on. All right, one steering knuckle, 2 new ball joints, everything's set to go. We'll put the grease zerks in. Okay, one thing that I did want to show you guys today is the adapters that came with these ball joints. They make it a little way nicer to put in or to press in. So they come with a ring. I'm going to set it on there. And they just seat so nice compared to trying to use an adapter like this that doesn't quite fit perfectly. Whereas you use the adapter that came with the ball joint, and now that adapter sits on there nice and square. And it's not such a big struggle to put these in square anymore. After we have it back on the vehicle. Okay guys, before we get started, I just wanted to show you one thing. The lower nut is a lock nut, and I just want to show it to you. If you look on here, you see the triangle dimples in the nut. Okay, they've been pushed in, and see how it mushrooms the top of the threads? Okay, that doesn't require a cotter key or anything of the nature. So keep it in mind. Nuts already have some kind of Loctite thread applied to them, not the end of the world. Let's go ahead and get this installed. One more thing before we get started, guys. There's a camber caster adjuster right here. And I simply made a mark in the event that mine came out. It may not. Totally dependent on the situation. So I knew the orientation going back in. Keep this in mind. Okay, there we go. Knuckle installed. Let's throw the cotter key in quick before we forget. Cotter key installed. Not a terrible process at all. Looks pretty decent. Much better feel. I should keep this front end from bouncing around. Okay, let's go ahead and install the grease zerks and throw some grease in these joints before we go any further. Locate this grease zerk in a manner where we can actually get to it later on. Little shot of grease in each one. Wipe off any extra. We don't want to look like some shade tree mechanic. Next in is the axle. After the axle comes the spindle. Just wipe off any dirt or debris off from that spindle. Make sure we don't booger up that seal when we put it back on. Okay, next on is the hub assembly, rotor assembly, or hub and rotor assembly. Okay, now that we've got the rotor and hub assembly on, let's get that spindle nut on. I'll kind of walk you guys through that and how I do it, what's worked for me for plenty of years. So we have the spindle nut, goes on in this orientation right here. Go ahead and start it by hand or with your fingers. And then for me, to simply speed up the process, I use a socket and an impact smartly. And I come back with a ratchet and the socket. And I snug it up pretty tight. I can still move the hub. And then I just back it off. And hand tight. Okay guys, next up is the spindle nut retainer. I'll show you a close-up after I get it in. Looks exactly like this. All right, if you look in there, you see a notch cut in the spindle. The retainer is put inside of that notch and goes on the outside threads of the spindle. Okay. Next up is the outer hub portion. Line up the splines. Push it to the bottom of the hub. Outer lockout retainer. Done. All right, last thing to put on is the lockout cover. Lockout operates. Okay, let's go ahead and install the tie rod in. Throw a shot of grease in there. Let's get a fresh cotter key for that tie rod. And let's put the caliper back on. Okay guys, that's it. Put the wheel on, torque the wheel, and job complete. And we have some other small stuff to do on this particular vehicle, so I'm going to finish that up, get the wheel back on, take it for a test drive, let you guys know how it turned out. Thank you much. Hey guys, it's 10 to 1 in the morning, in the middle of editing tonight's video about ball joint installation, and through the editing process it dawned on me that maybe we should cover a couple of things. First and foremost, safety. Safety glasses, so on and so forth. You feel the need to use them, use them. I'm not condoning one way or the other. At some point in the video I'm sure that you've seen that we're using plenty of heat, and I threw on a glove to get a nut off. You know, use your head, common sense when we're doing this kind of stuff. None of it is rocket science. So, you know, be smart about what you're doing. Now that we've shot the video, there's a handful of items that I want to talk about, problems that we ran into along the way. First and foremost, the entire ball joint was spinning, and you see me roll a screw jack underneath there and put some pressure on that knuckle, and I simply did that knowing that them two tapered surfaces, if I put pressure on the bottom of the knuckle, then it would keep that joint from spinning inside and I could actually get the nut off. We run into these kinds of problems all the time. That's just one way that I get over that particular situation. I'm going to pull out some extras and kind of some incidences that happen along the way. There's not a lot of prep. I try to shoot this stuff on the fly so you guys can see it in as close to real life as possible. You know, it's not this huge setup, you know, the nuts just spin off. Most everything that you guys are going to see is exactly how it happened, you know, unless it turns into some 20-minute operation that you don't need to see in the first place. With the lockout, I went to screw the retainer in, got it in there a little cockeyed, didn't realize it, snapped the thing off, and that began a whole nother problem. So I drilled it out and tried to use an easy out first. That easy out didn't pan out. Went out, drilled a larger hole, and wound up in a position where I was just simply able to use a low profile panhead self-tapping screw. Not a big deal at all. And everything worked out. The vehicle's now together. I went out and test drove it already. Thing works great. There's no front end shake. And the brakes work and steering and a number of other things that were going on. This vehicle happens to be a fleet vehicle. Some things that I wanted to talk to you guys about that is different from per se maybe the way that I would work on my own truck versus the way that I'm working on a customer's vehicle. When I'm working on my own truck and customers' vehicles, preventative maintenance or letting them know, hey, let's replace this because I'm there already, huge concern of mine. In this particular application, there's just a handful of things that if it was my own at that mileage, I probably would have done on my own vehicle, but you know, money being a limiting factor, time being a limiting factor, along with a million other things, they simply chose not to go this route. And one being, you know, pulling off the seal, the rear seal off from that hub and rotor assembly, pulling the bearings out, cleaning that stuff up, putting new races and bearings in, putting a new seal in. It just wasn't in the cards on this particular job, which isn't a big deal. I totally have faith that them wheel bearings are just fine. They're not a high failure rate in the first place, so I don't really see a need to change them immediately. Vehicle has 263,000 miles, and because I've worked on the vehicle so many times, I just simply know that we did that, you know, within the last 60, 70,000. It doesn't bother me at all. You'll see a funny look on my face when I go to put the caliper on. I just happened to check the front brakes while I was putting the caliper on, specifically so that you guys could see me check them, but also at the same time, you should be checking that stuff. You have the component off, check it while you're there. I happened to turn it, look at it, and notice that there's maybe 1/8 of an inch of brake pad left on the inner, and it's time to change it. Talked to the customer this evening. He wants to do pads and go, which works out fine. There's no rotor damage or anything of that nature, but had we let it go for another month or so, very easily could have been into putting rotors and possibly even more. I apologize for some of the camera angles. We're trying to get used to this and make it work for you guys. I know everything is shot up close, so you don't get to see a lot of me, which is totally okay with me. But the idea is to show you guys what's going on with this stuff at an angle and close enough where you can easily repeat this stuff on your own. So if you have questions, if you have comments, concerns, message me or leave a comment below, and I'll do everything I can to make sure that them questions get answered. You'll notice that I did the ball joints on the bench with the ball joint press. That's not my normal go-to process. Usually that steering knuckle will go in a bench vise, and it just makes it a whole lot easier in order to press them ball joints in and out. I happen to have a transmission apart on the bench in the shop that has the transmission torn apart, that has the vise on it, and I don't want to disturb that stuff, bad timing, so on and so forth. So forgive me for doing it on top of the bench. Camera angles, so on and so forth. Like I said, we're going to try and get better with that stuff. And then, I'm not going to lie, guys, this is a very difficult thing to do, to sit here in front of a camera and try to explain to you guys without having that one-on-one interaction. Whereas if you were standing there, it's about 150 times easier for me to have these conversations. But I'll try to work on that so that you guys get a real smooth and clear understanding of what's going on. Once again, I just want to thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe. Have a good evening. Next is the spring and inner lockout, or inner half of the lockout. Line up the splines. It's got a small Phillips right here. All right, last thing to put on is the lockout cover.